there are a few places more aware of the effects of climate change than our neighbours in the Pacific. At the Pacific Islands Forum earlier this year, climate change was declared the biggest security threat to the region.
Now, Ben Bohane has been covering the region as a photojournalist for over 20 years. I sat down with him to talk through some of his work and how he's seeing the change in the Pacific.
It does appear we're becoming more vulnerable to, issues of climate change. And when we talk about climate change, it's not just about rising seas, although that is obviously a major component. It gets manifest in many other ways, increasingly intense storms. There's health issues, the rising prevalence of mosquito-borne diseases like dengue. So there's many issues that it touches on, and yes, I think, and even just speaking to many of the old people who've noticed the shoreline retreat over years, that's how you do get a sense of how the environment is changing for them.
Let's look through some of your pictures now. Let's start off with this couple here. What's the story behind them?
This was a couple on Tegua Island in the far north of Vanuatu. And it was actually the first climate change story I was ever commissioned to do, probably about 10 or 12 years ago for the Sydney Morning Herald. And I went up there because they were the first community officially in the world to get finance through the United Nations to move the village to higher ground. They had, many stories about how their villages were being inundated. They'd noticed the sea level rising, and the older people were saying, yes, once upon a time we used to play here around these coconut stumps, and now you see these coconut stumps right out in the water.
Well, this man here you can see sitting on that coconut stump. I mean, he's certainly seen the environment change over his time.
He has, yeah. These ones are actually in the Carteret Atolls in Booker, off Booker in Bougainville. So, some of these photos you do actually get the sense then of how the sea has started to come in and really eat away at their coastline. And that affects them in all kinds of ways. Maybe the biggest issue for many of these isolated atolls and islands is the growing salinity problem. So when you get these inundations, it taps into their groundwater and into the soil. And if you get these king tides washing over every, once or twice a year, then it will destroy their crops, basically. So in the case of the Carteret Atolls, they can no longer survive on root crops, their taro and sweet potato. So now they're basically living on bananas, coconuts and fish.
Ben, you also spent some time covering Cyclone Pam back in 2015 and the aftermath of that. What was that experience like?
Look, it was a pretty scary night, actually. I've spent my life covering war and disaster in other places as a photojournalist, and so you feel particularly vulnerable when it comes to you. And it was one of the biggest storms in history, up to 300-kilometre winds, and so it really devastated Vanuatu for a good year or two afterwards.
Tell me about the resilience of these people that you photograph and how they're adapting to their environment.
Pacific Islanders are resilient by nature. They're used to adapting to whatever their circumstances are, and they'll always find ways to make the best of any situation. But, they are also very, very concerned about climate change, and it's now being reflected at the political level. The recent Pacific Islands Forum, there was a new declaration, and almost every Pacific government now sees climate change as their #1 security issue. So it's transcending all kinds of other issues. It's not just an environmental issue. In some of these places, it's an existential threat to the country itself. So for Pacific Islanders, it's become front and centre and a major, major issue. And it's why, they're also very concerned about Australian government policy at the moment that seems not to be adopting the science or recognising the vulnerability of our near Pacific neighbours.